Are you looking to get tack sharp photos, or maybe you're looking for motion blur in your images? Those two things are going to be determined by your shutter speed. Shutter speed refers to the length of time in which your camera shutter stays open, determining the amount of light which hits your camera sensor. So if your shutter opens and closes really fast, that means that it's going to freeze the detail in your scene. And the reverse is true. If you have a slower shutter, that's going to allow more blur into your scene, which is also referred to as motion blur. Your shutter speed also determines the lighting for your photo, because the longer that the shutter is open, the more light it's going to allow to hit your camera sensor, and then the faster it closes, the less light it's going to allow to hit that camera sensor. So with this brief simplified view of what shutter speed is, let's dive into how we'd create tack sharp images and how we'd create images with motion blur, and when you'd want to use both these techniques. If you want to create a tack sharp photo, you want to know the minimum shutter speed that you don't want to go under. A lot of beginners will go out and take photos, and then they'll get home, look at their images, and wonder, why does my image look soft?
Dang it!
But it's all a result of your shutter speed being too low. When it comes to shooting subjects in motion, shutter speed is really important, because if you want a tack sharp image, you need to make sure that your shutter speed is high enough to compensate for your subject's movement as well as your own movement. If I'm personally going to be shooting a subject that's in motion, I've already predetermined that the lowest shutter speed that I'll want is 1/500th of a second if I want that really tack sharp photo. And for most use cases, that's going to be an extreme minimum, because that's still going to allow motion blur into my photos sometimes, but like I said before, it honestly just depends on the rider's movement as well as my own movement. I'll only start going down towards that minimum if it starts to get darker outside and I need more light in my image. Also, I know that if I'm going down to that shutter speed, I'm going to have to keep my movements to a minimum so that I can keep my subject in really sharp detail. Once you become familiar with the minimum shutter speed that's going to work for the environment and the movements, you'll be able to start producing shots really quick instead of needing to do a bunch of test shots in order to dial in that shutter speed. Now, if you find yourself in an environment where you are running out of light, there's only 3 options that you have. You can either lower your aperture, raise your ISO, or add more light into the scene. Raising your ISO is definitely going to introduce noise in your image, but if you are shooting raw, you should be able to clean up that image really nicely in Lightroom with the denoise tool. A really good rule of thumb when shooting action is go with the highest shutter speed that your environment allows, and then compensate with your aperture and ISO to add more light into your scene. And then if you do need more light in your scene, then you can just bring down your shutter speed. This is where having a lens with an f-stop of 1.2 or 2.8 is going to be really helpful, because you're going to be able to shoot longer in those low light settings, where you won't have to sacrifice bringing down your shutter speed as much. Okay, on to point number 2, let's talk about how to achieve the best looking motion blur in your shots. Motion blur has a few different use cases that helps to enhance the story that a photographer is trying to tell, but for this video, we're going to talk about how it demonstrates speed. As an action sports photographer myself, I personally love using motion blur in my shots, because I feel like it enhances the visual representation of the power, speed, and aggression of my athlete. So just like with creating a tack sharp image, we need to know our minimum and maximum standard of where we want our shutter speed to be in order to create the perfect motion blur where it's not going to look too overdone. For myself, I'm personally usually going to be starting at 1/250th of a second, and I'm just going to adjust from there based on the motion of my subject. For a maximum, I'm usually going to be using 1/500th of a second, but I'm really going to need to be tracking really fast with my subject in order to create motion blur. You might be wondering though, well, didn't you just say that that's your minimum for a sharp photo? It is, but like I said, it all just depends on how fast I'm moving with my subject, because if I'm whipping really fast, that's also going to introduce some motion blur. The blur definitely isn't going to be as aggressive, but that might be a look that I am trying to go for. And then the minimum for me is going to be 1/125th of a second, but that's really pushing it. To get a decent result with this shutter speed, I found that I need to be really steady in order to pull this off. But making sure that you get the right amount of motion blur for the certain type of look that you're trying to pull off is gonna require a little bit of experimenting. So if you don't nail the exact look that you're trying to go for on the first time and you had the luxury to do it again, then just communicate with your subject or your athlete just to do that again so you can really dial in the look that you're going for. So whether you choose a faster shutter speed or a slower shutter speed should always be to enhance your artistic story that you're trying to tell. My advice would be to experiment with a bunch of different shutter speeds and just see how that affects your image, get to know your minimums and maximums so you can become really fast and really efficient on a photo shoot. If you're also wondering how aperture affects your action shots, I got a video for you right here. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.